Okay, so thank you again all for joining us here tonight. Very excited to be joined by Wayne Mueller for his Boston Burn, Inside the Largest Arson Case in U.S. History. Author Wayne Mueller is here to discuss his book. We're going to relive how a conspiracy of 9 men, including 3 Boston cops and a Boston firefighter, burned Boston and surrounding communities in the early 1980s. Their arson destroyed 264 buildings, causing millions in damages and hundreds of injuries. Their motive? Tax-cutting measures that caused layoffs of hundreds of police and firefighters. So Wayne has an extremely impressive resume. I'm just going to highlight a few things. Mueller, was one of the investigators on the case. He was a special agent, criminal investigator, and a certified fire investigator for the U.S. Treasury Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. And during his 25-year career, he has examined more than 2,300 fire and explosion scenes, responded to over 25 major incidents, and testified as an expert in more than 40 cases in federal and state court in both civil and criminal cases. And Boston Burn is his first book, and I've just been told that he's already working on his second. And again, this program is sponsored by the Friends of the Tewksbury Public Library. So all 40 of us or so watching live, and then also those joining us on Facebook and later on YouTube. Let's give a big virtual round of applause to Wayne for joining us here tonight. And Wayne, you can finally take it away. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you for asking me to be here. Originally scheduled for back in April, live, and we had to cancel like everybody else for the virus. So I really appreciate you for asking and for the Friends of the Library for hosting this. So I also thank the people who have already purchased the book, really helped the Amazon ratings. I was actually #1 in criminal evidence twice this past week, a #1 bestseller, which shocked me. I had no idea that it was going to happen. So it was pretty neat to see. This case was part of my life for 3 years back from 1982 to 1985. Now it's part of my life again for 3 years. When I started writing this book about 2 years ago, and I actually wrote the entire book in 11 months. Boston Globe correspondent, columnist got a hold of me and said that he was going to do a Sunday magazine article on it. We sat down with him, and he happened to mention he was going to do maybe a bigger story on it. The next day I started typing. I started typing because I had been thinking about doing this book for years and just never did it. And I was working full-time again as a private citizen, working fires and explosions, traveled to 43 states in that meantime. But every night I would type for about 5 to 6 hours every single night, got it done in 11 months, less than 11 months. And then the editing process. I love the writing process, but let me tell you, the publishing process is organized crime, is what I'd call it. I hope traffic wasn't too bad for you people getting here online. I know the internet gets pretty busy this time of day. There's one thing I'd like to do that I've done for every one of I had 34 live events before the COVID hit, and 20 events were canceled since then. Plus, I don't know how many I would have been invited to on top of it, which didn't happen at all. But what I've done for every single presentation is just read to you the dedication page. It came to me after I wrote the book, in a matter of 2 minutes of thinking about it. The exact words that I'm going to read to you are the ones that came to me in a short period of time. A lot of people dedicate the book to their wife and family and things like that. But this one here really epitomizes this book. To all those who have been victims of fires, to the firefighters who fight them, and to the fire investigators who go the distance, may you all have the strength to carry on. Every time I read it, I actually choke up because I've lived this. I know the victims, people who have lost property, people who have been hurt, and people who have died from fires. As a matter of fact, at this point in time, 50% of my profits actually go towards fire victims and helping to enhance fire safety. Uh, Firefighters and the firefighter foundations, and I've been happy to give. And let me tell you, the Connecticut Burn Foundation, who hosts a burn camp for kids, they have loved it because they were the first charity that I found, and I've given a few $1,000s to them at this point. They host children for a week at a time, 8 to 18 years old, who have severe burns. That way they can all go to the summer camp and be with people who have the same injuries that they had. And nobody looks at them funny or anything like that. So to the victims, to the firefighters, I know firefighters all over the country. With the travel that I've done, I've talked to firefighters all over. Plus now with the book and let me tell you, the internet, I have 5,000 friends, and most of them are police and firefighter. Same thing with LinkedIn. So I know what they go through. Remember, they go into that building when everybody else wants to be outside that building. And they save people in those buildings, no matter who that person is. They don't know single thing about the person. But these firefighters are so dedicated. Yes, people look at them and they say they sit in the firehouse day after day. But let me tell you, when that call comes in, that one call, it could be the last call for these firefighters. On December 3rd is the 21st anniversary of the Worcester warehouse, the Worcester 6 fire. And I was at that fire for 10 days. That's going to be one of the little stories in my new book. From my personal view of me standing at that fire scene and working that fire, what I saw, what I felt during the 10 days that I spent there, from the night it was burning until we figured out what happened. I was an investigator for 38 years altogether. 20 plus with the federal government and another 17 on the private side. I know what fire investigators go through. I know that I worked 17 below in St. Johnsbury, Vermont for the entire day, how cold it was. I also worked 95 degrees and humid in an attic in Dedham for 2 days, collecting evidence out of the attic area. And those things are enough to make you tired. But then you get totally black and you're breathing all that bad stuff. And it's a lot of hard work. So to all the investigators who try to find the truth, I dedicate this book to them. May you all have the strength to carry on. So this story, on top of the book, on top of the page, it says the largest arson case in the history of the country. Let me put the slides on here. Click, share. Okay, you should have them up there on your page now. Give me a thumbs up, Robert.
Yeah, nice job, Wayne.
The largest arson case in the history of the country. This book was, the cover was designed by my son-in-law. He's a graphic designer, Mike Clark. And also my webpage, burnbostonburn.com, he designed that. We made a mistake, actually, and I never changed it. This is the story of the largest arson case in the history of the country. But that should have been in quotation marks. Former U.S. Attorney, who later became our governor, Bill Weld, was the one who actually made that statement. When the arrests were made, he called it the largest arson case in the history of the country. So it really should have quotation marks around it. Some people around the country might beg to differ. Thomas Sweat was arrested in the Washington, D.C. area, a lone individual. We have 9 people in this conspiracy. Thomas Sweat set about 350 fires over 25 years. Some of them were cars. We have cars too that we didn't count in our 264. We have 200 dumpsters we didn't count in our 264. We only counted the structures. Also, Robert Orr, he's out and he's in prison in California. Killed a couple people in one of his fires. Robert Orr was one of the most well-known fire investigators in the state of California. And for about 20 years, he was setting fires. And he finally got caught. It's a great story. It's on Forensic Files. It's point of origin. Joseph Wambaugh wrote a story about him. And he, over this 20-year period, he has never confessed to how many fires. They're alluding to maybe 1,000 fires. Well, he has never confessed to any of that. They're just guessing in a sense. I have documented from the inside sources, from the arsonists themselves, 264 clear fires. We know the address and dates and how they set them. So I call it now the largest arson case in the history of the country, period. So we'll keep the period in there. I like showing this map to people outside the Boston area who are not quite familiar with Boston. You can see to the right-hand side of the screen is the water. That's to the east of the city. This particular slide goes all the way out to Weston and Wellesley on the left-hand side to the west. Down to the south, you go down into Hyde Park, Milton, Quincy, West Roxbury. And to the north, Chelsea, Everett, Revere, Winthrop. The reason I put this here is because of the next slide. These are the first 107 fires only set by this crew. Who was this crew? I think that's the proper way to say it. I like my English to be somewhat proper. So we had a bunch of individuals who were well known in the city of Boston because one was a Boston police officer, two of them were Boston housing police officers. Another one was a Boston firefighter full-time. One owned a security company that operated out of South Boston. So these guys were well known in the area. Two of these other guys were volunteer firefighters, call firefighters out in the Acton Stowe area, but they became very popular people in Boston because besides being public figures, they were also fire buffs. Now, there are fire buff organizations like Box 52 in Boston and the Boston Sparks Association. They are legitimate groups of people who like to collect memorabilia, people who like to take photos at fires, like to watch firefighter operations. They collect all different things, helmets, fire trucks, etc. Anything to do with older fires. And these buff organizations are all over. They're nicknamed Sparks, the Boston Sparks Association. And then there's a somewhat derogatory term that sometimes people use as a nickname, calling them Sparkies. Sparkies is sometimes associated with somebody who might set a fire. So what an unusual group we had. They met each other across from Boston Fire Headquarters off of Mass Ave in the Dorchester area. And that's where they would congregate to go chase fires. They have their mock cruisers. A lot of them were black LTDs and Chevy sedans, similar to what the police drove, unmarked vehicles, black sidewalls, whip antennas. As a matter of fact, when they parked next to each other, the whip antennas look very much like the fishing fleet that you might see in the harbor. And they called them the tuna fleet because the tuna fishermen would have the long rods and it would look like whip antennas. They drove around in those vehicles and they waited next to fire headquarters, listening to the scanners and the radios. And they would respond to fire scenes all over the city of Boston. Boston's had its history of burning before these guys started. So what kicked these guys off finally? They just used to chase fires. They were legitimate people. Proposition 2.5. We just had the 40th anniversary on November 4th. Happened to be November 4th, 1980. Was the 20th birthday of Master Arsonist to be, Greg Bemis. This photograph, by the way, the photograph on the front of the book is, and I give him credit in the back, that came from arsonist Greg Bemis. This is American cellophane fire in Jamaica Plain. It makes a great shot for the cover. It made a great shot for court evidence also. But these guys, when Prop 2.5 was coming in, they got very worried. What happens when something like this got passed? You know, it's a tax cutting measure here in Massachusetts. But when it first came in, the cities and towns had no idea what it was going to do to the taxes, the tax base. And who gets laid off first? It's the teachers, firefighters, police officers. When that started happening in Boston, let me give you just a hint in Boston. 1,700 firefighters in the city of Boston prior to Prop 2.5. Within 2 years' time, between a rapid attrition program and immediate layoffs, they lost 600 positions out of 1,700. What is that? 35 to 40% almost. That's a lot of positions. And 22 fire companies closed down. You know, they just locked the doors, and on the big overhead door, they painted the words closed. And some of these guys, when they're going to fires, they saw some deaths happen immediately after the layoffs happened. Right around the corner from one of these firehouses that's closed, 2 people died in a house fire. Maybe not necessary that those people died if the fire company closest could respond. Instead, the fire company had to come from much further away, and that fire can develop a lot faster and trap people in a house. So the reason I only put 107 is twofold. First of all, as you can see, those pin marks already cover the city, and they're overlapping. These guys were so busy setting their fires. They started February 17th of 1982, the very first fire. This is it right here in the Roxbury area. They targeted abandoned houses. The city of Boston's no longer like this. You can hardly find an abandoned house in the city of Boston. Everything now is either remodeled or bulldozed down and made into a new house. And pay attention to the the building on the left, the 4-story brick. You might see that again later on if I have time to get that far in these slides. All of these, by the way, came from Bill Noonan. He was a Boston Fire Department photographer for 35 years. He has a couple books out of his photos, and he's a great guy, and he allowed me to use the photographs for the book and for presentations and for any upcoming film that may develop out of this. We are in the process of trying to get this to film. I do have an agent now, and he's working with a lot of different producers and just trying to see the right package that they can put together. So Proposition 2.5 went into effect in 81, and still layoffs continued into 82. So February 1982, they set this first fire. They started with dumpsters actually first. And they would go in the back bay. You know, you drive on Sparrow Drive, and you look to the Boston side, and you're looking at the back of all those brownstones. And that's where all the dumpsters are for the trash for the people who live in those brownstones. And they would just go down those back alley and put a little simple device, a little time delay device, and just toss it into each and every dumpster, up to 20, 30, 40, 50 at a time. And they'd go across the river to the Cambridge side, and they'd sit there and watch one fire pop up after another, and they'd listen to the radios. And you know, fire companies had to come from way outside the back bay. These guys didn't even know where they were heading. You know, you didn't have a GPS to tell you exactly what address you were going to. Once they reached the location, they didn't even know what location they were actually at. So they listened to the confusion on the radio and they laughed about it. Now, you're going to have a lot of opinions about these guys along the way. They were a twisted version of Robin Hood. Steal from the rich, give to the poor. Well, if we set enough fires, those guys are going to get rehired. And maybe we can get on the job. We're all a bunch of white guys. And, you know, back then, there were more minorities being hired than the white guys. So they said, well, maybe we can get hired too if we create enough jobs. And we want the people to start screaming. We want the press to pick this up. We want Mayor Kevin White to stop using firefighters and police as pawns. You know, you just can't use us that way, they said. So they said, we're going to set these fires. So these abandoned buildings was their way of doing it somewhat safely, if you can call a fire safe. Firefighters know that the place is abandoned. They know that nobody should be living there. So most often they didn't have to go inside. Now they're arriving in these pictures here. Uh, these guys are really just starting to attack the fire. You don't see any water being put on these fires yet. And most of the fires had a good head start because they had a device. At this time, they graduated from using this simple device in the dumpsters, which was, I never used to tell the crowds when I was teaching earlier back in the 80s, I wouldn't tell lay people what devices were comprised of back then. But now not only can you see it in my book, not only was it court record, not only on the internet, you can find anything you want. So now I'm not as leery of telling what these devices are. So they just took a simple match book with a lit cigarette interlaced to give them a little time delay. That's what they threw in the dumpsters first. When they started doing these buildings, they graduated to a little more sophistication, a little more sophisticated device that Greg Bemis actually learned about. He was the youngest member of this group at age 20. The oldest member was 35. That's Ray Norton, the Boston firefighter. And the other guys were all in between. But Greg learned of this device in a class for fire investigation. They'd walk down the street with a brown paper bag. Very innocuous. Nobody would pay. Very innocent, right? In the bag is a plastic Ziploc baggie with Coleman lantern fuel. Very volatile, very dangerous liquid. On top of that, they put some tissue, and then when they placed it at a building, whether it was outside or inside, then they would put their matchbook with the cigarette lace inside. And if you put the cigarette in a different position, it gives you 2 minutes, 3 minutes, 4 minutes, depending on how you place the cigarette. Now, their favorite targets of these abandoned buildings were ones that had what we call, nicknamed gas shingles. You probably have seen many of them, maybe not paid much attention. You know the asphalt shingles that's on the roof of so many houses here? Well, in the 1940s, they sided buildings with those asphalt shingles. And the reason they call them gas shingles is it's nothing but solid gasoline. It's a petroleum product that if you took a good light or two, you could get to burn, and it would race up to 2 or 3 stories to the roof line in a matter of a few minutes. Now you add a little liquid fuel in their device, and that really kicks that fire off. They also went inside these buildings. This one here looks like it's placed on the 2nd floor. This particular one is important because this is June 3rd, 1982. This is on Dot Ave, Dorchester Ave. And they placed it between the 2 buildings. Both buildings had gas shingles. You only have a little walkway that's 3 to 4 feet wide. And you get the heat that radiates back and forth between the buildings, climbs up, hits the roof line, and you can see the soffits up there, hits the roof line, it goes into the attic, and it goes into the upper floor windows. As you can see the building in the center there, it's blowing out every window. They set this fire, it's a multiple alarm fire. But then they went to Southie a short time later, and they graduated to commercial buildings. The Sparrow Toy Company, we called it. They imported cheap Chinese toys, stuffed animals, stuffed toys, and plastic toys, all in cardboard boxes on pallets in this building. It was full. They set this fire in the rear. You can hardly see the building because it's 1,000 feet long by 300 feet wide. This was on the Friday morning, June 3rd, 1982. This fire went to 9 alarms, and actually they had a special call where they actually had Cambridge and Quincy and Milton, Dedham show up to help fight the fire. They had every available person fighting that fire. Now, why was that fire so important? We had already been working the arson group in Boston that I became part of. I volunteered for the Boston ATF Arson Task Force. It started March 1982. Remember, their first fire was mid-February 1982. It had nothing to do with those guys starting to set fires. They didn't know a thing about us starting the Arson Task Force. We didn't know about them. It's just pure coincidence that the national government started 4 arson task forces in the country. Besides Boston, you had LA, Chicago, and New York, because the cities were burning. And the state and local people needed assistance. And that's what ATF was all about, giving assistance to state and locals, not taking over cases, but giving assistance. We had more expertise eventually. We had more money to share with the state and locals. We had tools. We had men who could dedicate themselves to the investigation. The Sparrow Toy Company caused the invitation to the National Response Team. I became a member of the National Response Team. There were 4 teams in the country: Northeast, Southeast, Midwest, and West teams. We respond any place in the country, and on occasion outside the country, within 24 hours after an incident. We had a Boston police officer killed in Rosendale with a bombing. We had a national response team come to that eventually. I was on the team at that point. That's one of the stories going to be in the second book. But the Sparrow Toy Company, being a commercial structure, gave it federal jurisdiction. These single-family abandoned houses, there's no federal jurisdiction. I can go to these fires and I can work these fires and I can help Boston and the state fire marshals take these fires to state court, but you can't take them to federal court because there's no jurisdiction. But when you have a business, every restaurant sells something like Heinz ketchup. Heinz ketchup comes from Pittsburgh. It's sold over interstate lines. And when you buy a product from Blue Sparrow Toy, who got his toys from China, and they're sold all over the country, it affects interstate commerce. That allowed ATF to have jurisdiction to work these fires. But we always worked them with Boston. And we found on that fire, we found the origin of that fire right at the rear on the railroad tracks. And they had set that fire using their device. It carried up the wall and carried inside the building. Okay, about halfway, Robert. I put this slide to show you on June 11th, 1982. There's only 4 fires listed here. There were 11 multiple alarm fires in Boston that night, just in the city of Boston. How many times do you have multiple alarm fires in the city of Boston now? Once a week, once every other week, you get a multiple alarm fire. If you look here, that one column that says number 9, and then number 6, number 3, and number 5, that's the number of alarms for the fires listed there. But there were 11 total fires that night, 10 of them set by this crew of people. So you had Greg Bemis, the youngest. He was an acting dispatcher, police and fire, and then he became a lieutenant. No, he became an officer in the Boston Housing Authority. But he was also a called firefighter. You had Robert Grabluski, a full-time Boston police officer. Ray Norton, a full-time firefighter. Ray Norton never set a fire. He actually just was part of the conspiracy and pointed out things and let these guys know that the arson squad's got a full complement of people out there on the streets on certain nights, things like that. The owner of the security company, Donald Stackpole, the meanest person in this particular group. He was nasty. He was different than the rest of them. All these guys eventually, once upon a time, wanted to be firefighters. Even the police officers wanted to be firefighters. So this is why they did what they did. It became nightly entertainment for them. And don't just be mistaken that they had this great motive in their own minds of setting these fires to try to get firefighters back on a job. They did it because it was entertainment. They had lots of friends who were Boston firefighters and fire buffs. And the conversation in the summer of 82 into 83 was, who's doing this? Oh, maybe we should give that guy some of our paycheck to get more gasoline, 55-gallon drum on payday, that type of thing. The Boston firefighters liked having to work with all the layoffs happening, but they also started realizing the injuries were happening. This is American Cellophane, the same fire that's on the book cover. They actually hit that building twice. It was so big, both fires looked very similar to these pictures right here. This is June 11th in right behind the Keystone building off the expressway. If you know that building, with the apartment building now. Norwood was actually the first fire department to show up at that particular fire. I love this picture with the silhouette of the firefighter. There's no water in his hose yet. It's not going to do too much in putting that fire out and maybe protecting the exposures to his right. And there's probably one right to the left. American Cellophane. You can just imagine that chief probably shrugged his shoulders at some point and said, what am I going to do with this, right? That was a YMCA and then a daycare center. This particular one was January 1983. Now, they ramped up from that first fire. They set maybe 10 fires in the first couple of weeks. But then, as spring became summer of 82, they were setting 20, 30, almost 40 fires in a month time. By October, November of 82, we still didn't have a good suspect. We had heard about a couple of the guys that were fire buffs, but hearing about them and getting evidence are two different things. So this particular fire was real interesting. They really planned to do this fire. You can see the partial words down the bottom. It actually says Ziola Brothers. They were heating, ventilation, mechanical operation. They own that building. But on the upper floors where you see the fire, it used to be Box 52, the Sparks Club, and they had recently moved out, and the upper floor was actually the Boston Sparks Club. And that they lost so much memorabilia. These guys, Arthur Fiedler was one of the great, well-known fire buffs in the city of Boston. He used to chase fires with these guys, not the guys in my arson conspiracy, but before them. And the Boston Fire Museum is a great take. It's free when it's open. It's just down from the Children's Museum on Congress Street. And they just ask for a donation. Maybe you put some money in the box. But they have so much great stuff, including Arthur Fiedler's collection of helmets. This is the Boston Sparks Club. They did it because two members of the conspiracy were members of the club, and two more guys got rejected by the club multiple times. So this was vengeance, this particular fire. These are the types of conditions these guys had to work in a lot of times. There's that 4-story boarded up brick right across from the very first fire was on the right-hand side. Get them. Now, I'm going to show you a couple videos. Oh, I love this one by Bill Noonan. What a great shot. This is Clarendon, and it's in the South End. It's a church fire. This an earlier shot, and then the flames blowing out of that giant circular, what used to be stained glass window, about 100-year-old church. I'll come back to that letter. Stop shooting. I'm only going to show you, this goes a lot longer. Normally, I'm only going to show you 3 fires. I do have this shut down because there's a lot of noise in the background. This was October 2nd. It said October 10th, but it's mistakenly made by somebody else. It was October 2nd, 1982. By then, about 140 fires had been set by this crew. And again, we had suspects, a list of 18 suspects on any one day. We'd eliminate 2, add 2, Ed Fowler over in Cambridge, along with Nat Whittemore, WBZ cameraman. Both of them were fire buffs at the same time. Both of them were camera people at the same time. But Ed Fowler was Cambridge arson investigator, a great friend of mine, and Nat Whittemore. These are all Nat Whittemore's videos, by the way. He's retired after 40 years from WBZ. He's one of my biggest supporters. I love the guy dearly. The Boston Sparks is a great supporter, and they have helped me all along the way. So this particular fire, we called it the E Street Military Barracks. South Boston used to be a very military area with bases during World War II. The importance of this fire, the second of the month, they actually called in a bomb scare at Mass General because the Boston Bomb Squad was housed directly next door. They wanted to get them away so they could burn this particular building. When they set this fire, it didn't seem like it was going to take off. They left and went to set a couple more fires, and they didn't really particularly pay attention to the radio calls that were coming in for this fire. They heard about some ambulances showing up, but the reason is the roof collapsed and 22 firefighters went down with the roof. This was one of the most serious fires for injuries. Nobody died, luckily. Altogether in their history of setting fires, over 200 Boston firefighters were injured. 22 of them at this fire came crashing down, some into the fire, broken legs, broken backs. I asked one of them to be part of the Chronicle. I don't know if you people saw the Chronicle episode. You can find it still partially on YouTube. It aired in November last year, and then February they did a repeat. This is my friend being loaded into ambulance. He had a broken back. We asked him to be part of the Chronicle episode, and he declined because 35 years later, he still has PTSD. He would have added something to the Chronicle episode as a victim. Really would have been interesting. But by talking to him, I connected with him again about a year ago, and it was really interesting talking to him. This particular fire, they have now graduated from that device to adding one more element. There's so many abandoned tires thrown in vacant lots around the city of Boston. Who knew what to do with a tire back then, 35 years ago? Now, when you have brand new tires, the old ones for a fee are taken away by the company you buy your tires from. But before, you could pick up tires, throw 3 in the car. They put their device right where all those flames are to the right-hand side. They put their device right in a tire well on the outside of the gas shingles. This was owned by Polaroid. $5 million worth of equipment in this building. Nobody sprinkled buildings back then, and this was a kind of an older, crappy building. The importance is now you can see the remains of the tire, the steel belts, and a little bit of, I'll call it rubber, the treads that were at the bottom, at the base of that device. We started finding that at multiple fire scenes, so we could definitely connect the same people of setting the fire. This is Ed Fowler right here in the red cap picking it up. He's since passed away, but he's showing his chief, we got this device here. Ed and Nat Whittemore knew some of this crew, and they didn't particularly like some of these crews. The same guys who got rejected by the Sparks Association. They got rejected because when people showed up at fire scenes, they would be loud, boisterous. They would actually root for the home team. I'm going to let this fire run while I talk. We were running from fire to fire. Boston Arson was doing the scene work at most of the fires. Eventually, I became a scene origin and cause, trying to figure out where and how fire started. I became an expert at that, and that's what I ended up doing the rest of my life, just about, is going to fire scenes and explosion scenes and figuring out what happened. But Boston was doing all the city ones. And then the state fire marshals, because we started doing surveillances all over Boston, ATF, Boston PD, Boston Fire. We'd have the streets not saturated, but we would concentrate in areas. So what these guys did, they set 2 fires in Quincy, raced through the city of Boston, set 2 fires in Chelsea, Everett line. This particular one is out in that direction right now. One night they went to Fitchburg. Very dramatic scene happened in Fitchburg. Great for a movie, guys. I don't want to give it up if you haven't read the book, but extremely dramatic, where we could have had some fatalities that were not caused by a fire. I want to pause this for a second. So they went to Fitchburg in the fall of '82, and they set 4 multiple alarm fires in that one night. We're talking a couple mill buildings and a couple triple deckers. They were raging fires. They went to Lawrence, set 3 fires. They went to Lowell, set 4 fires. Cambridge, they set a couple more fires. Down in Canton, they set a 150-foot barn on fire one night because there used to be a fire truck parked outside. And they set it on fire because the owner didn't sell that fire truck to Donald Stackpole. Again, sort of vengeance, right? A good target at the same time for them because it's pushed back from the road. Well, there was a fire lieutenant who I met back in '82. When he was going to the fire, he said over the radio, "It's going to the moon." And that little quote stuck in their minds. They were listening to the radio right after they set the fire. A month later, they set another fire in Canton, and they called the fire department and they did this out in Fitchburg, and they did it in Lowell and Lawrence. They called the fire department. How crazy is this? To say, "Hey, aren't you glad the Boston arsonist is in town?" Well, in Canton, they said, "Oh, you remember that fire at the barn where they said it's going through to the moon? Well, pull up your bootstraps because you got another one." And then they hang up. These guys wanted to take credit for these fires, and the press was all over it. The national press actually rode with us back then, and the Boston papers picked it up all over the place. Eventually, Life magazine. There's a full spread in Life magazine, the We Are the World issue of April 1985. My picture with the assistant U.S. attorneys. And matter of fact, they misidentified one assistant U.S. attorney. That was actually Ralph Gantz. Ralph just passed away a few weeks ago. He was the Chief Justice of the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court. And you know, that Miss Budd just got sworn in today, I think it was, or yesterday, to take his place. But Ralph Gantz was misidentified as Bill Weld, and they don't look anything alike, let me tell you. And and myself and another agent and the 2 U.S. attorneys were in that picture in April of '85. So the press was all over it. And there were some results as from their fires. Hyde Park had closed one station, and the citizens actually held it hostage. And they reopened that one because of the people screaming so loud. East Boston, there's only 2 firehouses over there in East Boston. And if you close one, you're going to have help from downtown Boston come through the tunnel to help you out. Now, how did we finally crack the case? It really was Nat Whittemore and Ed Fowler. This is Garrity 2. The reason we call it Garrity 2 is because a month earlier they had set their same Garrity lumberyard on the Dedham Hyde Park line on fire. Look at the size of this fire. They put 2 devices in this building with shingles and plywood, and it took off. And they would watch these fires, but it's not uncommon. Sparks all over the city of Boston fled to these fires. So just because people are watching these fires doesn't make them a suspect. But Nat Whittemore swung his camera around when he heard this crew rooting for the home team. Who's the home team? The fire's the home team. Not rooting for the fire department, because that's the visitors. They would root for the home team. And Nat heard this loud noise coming from a crew. So you're going to see it in a second. This was shown on TV after the arrest, but not immediately. You get civilians actually helping with the hoses back then because of the layoffs. You didn't have enough firefighters. I'm going to pause it for 1 second when it shows the crew sitting on a lumber pile. There were actually 5 of them there. Any second. Okay. You can see the one guy looking to his right on the left side of your screen. That's Boston police officer, not on duty. He's reaching across to his shoulder holster. about to pull out a sidearm. Donald Stackpole is squatting on the lumber pile. To the other side of the screen is Greg Bemis. Watch. He waves his gun in the air like he's on a bucking bronco. Joe Gorman's a rigger down at Quincy Shipyard, hiding his head. They looked over to the side there. Why? Because Ray Norton, the Boston firefighter, is actually outside the view of the camera. Because of that, WBZ invited Boston Fire and Police and ATF to view the raw footage next day, which we did. And we knocked on the door. My partner and I, Bill Murphy, and I knocked on the door of Wroblewski's apartment in Weymouth. Bobby was home. He let us in. And we interviewed him in his apartment. And Bobby said, "Oh, I don't know anything. I'm a fire buff. You know, I just hang with those guys. I don't know anything about fires." He lied really well to our face. And we were getting ready to leave, but on the floor was a firebox. Now, what's the significance of a firebox? You know what they are? Those little house boxes on poles and pedestals on sides of buildings. Back then, you could open the door and actually pull out a receiver and talk to Boston Fire Alarm, report a fire. A lot of times you just pull the alarm and it calls in the fire to fire alarm. Well, they stole 14 of them off pedestals and poles that year. Boston usually has one missing every year. That year they had 14 missing. And they collected them, not just as memorabilia, not just as a trophy, but because if you think of a residential area, Roxbury, Dorchester, Jamaica Plain, Southie, etc., Charlestown, in the middle of the night, the residential areas, and you had one of these, who's going to be able to report a fire now if they're driving down the street and see a fire at 2 or 3 a.m.? You know, you didn't have cell phones back then. So that was one way to do it. Now, if it's missing, the next one could be blocks away and you're going to have to find one. Who are you going to knock on somebody's door at 2 o'clock in the morning in some of these areas? Not typically in Boston. I don't think too many people would be happy about that. So they would steal them for that reason. And it would also cause a delay in reporting the fire and make that fire grow much larger. So they also knew how to set a fire in one street and call the closest fire companies and then set a fire from that company's area so nobody could respond in timely fashion to that fire. These guys knew what they were doing. Let me go back to the slide. So the firebox on the floor, receiving stolen goods, not a real big deal, but Wroblewski was getting charged with that, and Boston police were investigating that. They took him off the street, took his gun away. He was sitting in the dispatch area, the turret, they call it. You know, when you receive a call, 911, and what's your emergency? He was one of those. Well, he took a polygraph exam, and he flunked badly. I'm not sure why he took it. He was just playing with us. He had an attorney that says he can't talk, and we actually didn't get to talk to him. He took that the first week of December 1982, and his attorney says he can't talk. I didn't talk to Bobby again until January 1984, 13 months later. But what we did in the meantime was knock on the door of some of his associates, including Lieutenant Wayne Sandon from the Boston Housing Police. The same spiel with Bobby: you're law enforcement, we're law enforcement, you know, maybe we can help each other out, type of thing. Well, Wayne Sandon didn't turn me down flat. He said, I don't know anything, but, you know, I might be able to help you out. So then he told me about a car that they burned, a stripped, you know, an old stripped car that was abandoned in Southie. I didn't get too excited. Then he told me about a car that they set on fire but caught onto a commercial building. Well, I got a little more excited, but we wired him up and it didn't work for some reason, and you can read about that in the book. I like these teasers. But then he told us about another big piece. So we had the first big piece that got us to these guys, And we had this letter. This letter was sent to WBZ. It was put together by Greg Bemis with the agreement from everybody in the group. The 8th and 9th guys were just starting to come in a little bit later here. I'm Mr. Flair. You know me as the Friday Firebug. I will continue till all deactivated police and fire equipment is brought back. Down the bottom it says, if abandoned buildings are torn down, occupied buildings will be targeted next. That was a government exhibit. And that was sent to BZ. BZ called Boston Fire, who picked it up and brought it to Boston PD for fingerprints. You can actually see discoloration there. That's because of the fingerprint process. And they put it in a file drawer because they got no usable prints. ATF never learned about this until after Robert Grabowski finally got arrested. He was the first one we arrested. And that was partially because Wayne Sandon told me in August 1983 about a brand new cruiser, unmarked, stolen from Natick Ford parking lot by these guys. And they stole it for purposes of stealing parts off it to upgrade their personal cruisers and their Nerf cruisers that they drove around in. And then they dumped it in the Fort Point Channel between Southie and downtown Boston. They dumped it in the water. And he told us about that. We recovered it with Boston dive teams. We recovered that, but we recovered it in August. And we still didn't have enough focus to go after Grabowski until January 12th, 1984. Interviewed him that night at Boston PD headquarters. I can picture the whole thing. The drab colored walls, the old desks, the fluorescent light fixtures, you know, Boston's superintendent in the room, 2 detectives, and 2 ATF agents. Another extremely highly dramatic scene, how it came down. When Bobby confessed, and I'm skipping over parts, when he confessed to 29 fires in rapid order, I got sick. My stomach started spinning, my head, I had a headache. And then we brought him back to our office, got him away from Boston PD, and interviewed him on tape the rest of the night. We called the U.S. attorney, who showed up in the middle of the night. Robert Mueller, now the famous or infamous, depending on your point of view, Robert Mueller. I love the guy. I thought he was extremely intelligent and I respected him a lot. And so whatever you believe. I put one line in the book about that, just saying that he showed up and from that investigation and actually didn't give any opinion in the book. And I got a 2-star from somebody on Amazon rating because I mentioned that. And I also mentioned where we flipped Grabowski eventually. It was still, he had an attorney, a new attorney, federal court the next day. We couldn't talk to him again until May. But when we did, we flipped him and he wore wire 17 times between phone conversations and live meetings with these people. And we talk about flipping somebody to help an investigation move forward, something as old as Julius Caesar or older maybe. In spite of what the president said, is what I said in the book. And I got a 2-star rating because of those 2 lines. So, you know, I wasn't trying to be mean or anything. I was just stating in spite of what the president said. So I'm going to leave you with, I think this will go forward here. I've got another slide. Come on. I want to go back to that slide again. Oh, it should be going forward. At the very end of Chronicle, Greg Bemis, I asked him to be part of it because I spent 200 to 400 hours with Greg after we arrested him. And he also typed a 163-page journal his first 2 years in prison, which is a lot of basis for the dialogue that you read in the book. And it reads like fiction because of the dialogue and because of actual conversation between the arsonists. I spent so much time with Greg that I have this very strange, friendly professional relationship with him again today. He did spend 10 plus years in prison. At the end of the Chronicle episode, he didn't partake directly, but he did answer some emails. And the email says his response: 35 years later, regrettably, our actions caused some injuries, mostly minor in nature. Now, any firefighters in the audience, if you get trapped by a ceiling and you're not really hurt at that point in time, how close did you actually come to having a major injury or being killed? So to actually say they were minor in nature is really blowing it off. He said, until the October fire with the enlisted men's club, where those injuries were serious. He said, our ends didn't justify the means. However, the Traeger bill, which got signed by Governor King, which put money back into the coffers of the cities and towns to rehire some people, wouldn't have been passed at that time if it wasn't for our actions. So I'll let you people think what you may of Greg Bemis today, how much he might regret what he did. Again, I do see him every couple months. We have dinner together. I still questions that you might ask. I bring them to Greg, and he asks some of those questions and answers them so I can present them to people in the future. I've met so many people from all over and online. People have told me stories of their personal experience with these fires, and with like Ray Norton, the Boston firefighter, got 6 years because he never set a fire, but he's now a convicted pedophile. We suspected he had a lot of young boys around him then. In 1990, he was convicted of playing around with some young males. Grabluski, first one in the door, got 10 years, federal prison. Bemis got 30 years. He signed an agreement for 30 years, but parole was eligible after 10 years, plus his cooperation and everything, so he got out after 10. Some people still believe he should be in prison. Stackpole got 40 years, and he did 22, and he is now deceased. Wayne Sandon, the one who could have helped, never admitted to me, even when he got arrested, that he was part of 50 fires. And here's a guy who's keeping me on the line, giving me tidbits just to keep me interested. And that car that he told me about was a big break in the case, but he never told me about his involvement in fires and could have helped himself. He got 26 years. The eighth guy helped set some fires, a couple at the end. He got 4 years. And the ninth guy actually didn't have anything to do with fires. He was going to hide Grabluski in Ohio, where he lived. He was a friend of Stackpole and these other guys, and he was going to hide Grabluski. He agreed to hide Grabluski if he ran. So by joining the conspiracy that way, he actually got a couple of years in prison himself. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Robert, and the questions.
Great. Yep. So, folks, it would be great if anyone had any questions. Now would be the time to get them into the chat. Betty says that she can't wait to read your book. And so, Wayne, where is the? Let's start with a plug for your book here. Where's the best place for folks to purchase a copy of your book?
Well, if you go to burnbostonburn.com, all one word, you can get it directly from my website. There's PayPal there. I can do Venmo too. You just use my author Wayne Miller at Gmail, so you can use Venmo that way. If you have to, just get me, email me also on that and say I can only do it by check or something like that. The benefit for those is you can get some color pictures in your book, which the ones you get from Amazon has it. I think Walmart online still has it, but those are black and white versus the color that you can get from me. And of course, I will sign it. And if you send me something to personalize it, I will just the word, if you want your first name or somebody as a gift. I mean, Christmas is coming. So my website's about the best. It's virtually the same price. I include the mailing in the $29 for the hardcover and the $20 for the paperback. The mailing's already included.
So James wants to know, do you feel there was possibly more involved that the whole group wasn't aware of, or other buffs that might have worked separate from this group?
I would say not separate, except that there's only like one fire in the city of Boston. Happened on that June 11th night in Jamaica Plain. That these guys didn't set, that somebody else did. Not a group. We at times we had to. We couldn't help but think that some union members might have been involved because, hey, you got 400 of them laid off and 200 by attrition. You know they're going to be angry, some of them, and they might. But nope, nothing ever came up. We did arrest a lone individual who, the poor kid, he was like 19 years old, and he'd get paid on Thursday and go out and get drunk, spend most of his money on Thursday and Friday night, and he'd stick some stuff underneath the shingles of a house and catch occupied houses on fire. And we just happened to have a surveillance and actually caught him in the act. And the bosses all said, "Oh, this is great. We got it. We got it." Well, that wasn't even close. We knew it wasn't the same, but nobody else.
Robert wants to know, did any of these people have prior criminal records?
Stackpole had stolen property. He's the only one. He actually, I think that would help, not help, prevent him from being a firefighter or police officer. That's why he had the security company. But that's the only one. Nobody, nope, none of them. One kid was Lenny Kendall. I didn't mention at all. Lenny was a good friend of Greg Bemis. He was there for the first two fires, didn't set it, either one of them. And then he went in the Air Force and became a firefighter in the Air Force. And we had him brought back from England, where he was in the U.S. Air Force, to Georgia and brought him back to Boston. And he actually is the only one that didn't get jail time, by the way, probation.
Diane wants to know, were the guilty ever sued for monetary damages?
Good question. You know, I don't even remember ever talking to an insurance person. Now, I work 17 years on the private side with insurance people all the time. I don't remember ever even talking to an insurance person. But the people, the victims, the city, whoever owned these buildings, these guys really didn't have enough. Grabluski finally bought a house just before he got arrested. Bemis never owned a house. Ray Norton owned a small house in West Roxbury. There wasn't enough to really go after. I mean, their houses with the mortgages and stuff, probably only $100,000 is all they would have. And with the millions that were damaged and restitution, it wouldn't even cover anything.
What did their families have to say about what they did?
Besides spitting at us, initially that's the reaction that we got. Grabluski had adopted parents who were much older. They were sort of like grandparents' age by the time he was arrested. And, you know, they were downtrodden, shocked. Even with the confessions, some of the people wouldn't believe it. Greg Bemis, his mother died when he was 16. That might be part of Greg's motivation. She was a fire buff who took him to fires. She died of cancer when he was 16. He set fires on her gravesite, and his dad moved up to Maine a year later with a new woman and left Greg behind to finish high school here with stay with friends. So he didn't really have much family. There was not much reaction. We didn't get anything else besides that anger from people.
Mike wants to know, what happened to the companies that had their buildings burned down?
Sparrow Toy is a good example. They moved to New Jersey, never opened again. Loss of some 30-odd jobs and all the revenue, tax revenue base. Some of the other buildings, there's a couple tire companies. You know, in Boston had a lot of used tire companies. Never went back in business. Garrity Lumber, no longer in Dedham. They have other locations in New England, but no longer in Dedham. So just think about things like that, the lost revenue from taxes and lost jobs.
And Wayne, they also burned down a church, at least one church, you said?
Yeah, that church was not active at the time. And they did one church in that was active in Quincy also. I don't know if that one rebuilt. That was not totally destroyed. The one in Boston was totally destroyed.
Were the buildings targeted at random? I mean, clearly, you know, you talked about that business that, clearly one of them had a grudge with the owner. But were they strategically targeted, or was it more random? What was the thinking there?
About 90% of them were strategic. They actually would ride around during daylight hours and pick buildings out. Like when they did go out to Tewksbury, they had a few in mind out there, not so specific. Lawrence and Lowell, they had no idea. But around the city of Boston, they would go and they'd make lists, and they actually would go down the list and burn these buildings. They liked buildings that would be safe to get to at night and get away, back from the road a little bit a lot of times, or in those residential areas where nobody's awake and houses next to them are abandoned, that type of thing. They love those gas shingles. So they're very specific. Here's a funny story. They set one in the Revere Everett line in 82, and then 83, they set one on Dedham Hyde Park line, both owned by the same guy. But he had nothing to do with them. They just happened to pick the same type of building. Both of them were old factory style, pushed way back from the road. And let me tell you, the state police I worked with on that particular case, he almost jumped up and down on the owner's head, trying to get him to confess about being involved with the fire.
Yeah, just a coincidence, I guess.
Absolutely just a coincidence.
A few more questions, and then we're going to wrap. Robert wants to know, what new technologies of today would have solved the crime earlier?
This case could never happen today. Besides the security cameras on every corner, besides your cell phones, besides GPS in your cars and just GPS you might use to find places. Once we got these guys as suspects, then we could get all that information. Those security cameras on every corner, that would really capture them. Social media. I don't think that these guys held it together for 2 years, never telling anybody else. No girlfriends, wives, associates. They had guys right next to them, and then they'd go out and set fires, and they never let on any more than the 9 people in the group. So I think definitely that they would get caught because of this. And DNA, if you got a part of a device, you can get DNA off these devices if it didn't totally burn up.
James wants to know, what was the Boston firefighters' reaction to the arrest? Did they see them as criminals or Robin Hood, as the motivation was in their favor?
Well, I can tell you Boston police told Billy Murphy after we got the warrant for the Firebox. Billy's father-in-law was the head of internal affairs, in small world, right, for Boston. He told Billy, you are persona non grata here at Boston PD. And Billy used to spend a lot of time with Boston cops because we develop our information through a lot of the cops with their street sources. He says, no longer you're welcome in Boston. And the firefighters, they enjoyed most of it when it was happening. They were in that weird situation. They're there on the job to do that job, to fight fires, not to sit in a firehouse. So they loved being able to fight fires, and they loved the uptick in the number of fires. Now, I want to tell you, after that 264 buildings, Boston probably took another 10 years before they got 264 buildings burned. They just don't have that today. So the Boston fire guys were in a weird position, and I would say a bunch of them were not upset that the fires were happening, but they were upset. They didn't like Norton. A lot of them didn't like Ray Norton to begin with. He was an odd duck even in the firehouse back then. So they weren't totally unhappy that he got arrested.
All right, I'll take the final question, Wayne. Wayne, I want to know who plays you in the movie.
I have no idea. Yeah, he has to be about 30 years old.
Yeah.
So I just saw the TV made Richard Jewell movie, not the full length, but either one of those two guys could play Donald Stackpole. I can tell you that. I did put somebody's name down, somebody who looked a little similar to me back. I had a mustache back then. I still have all my hair. So somebody 30 years old.
I think he could play you now. Maybe we need a 30-year-old version of Tom Selleck. All right, I see a Tom Selleck right now on my screen. Okay. All right, so Tom, we've hit Tom. I just called you Tom. So Wayne, we've hit 8:15. Do you? So we'll wrap up here. Do you have any last words you want to leave the group with?
Maybe two. Again, just remember that 50% of my profits, so if you do buy a book, 50% of my profits have gone to charity. And in the last 18 months or so, about $5,000 worth so far. And hopefully keep an eye out. And I'm going to hit up Robert for another live session when the second book comes out next fall.
Yes, we'll definitely do it in person. So God willing.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Wayne. Thank you all for joining us here on Zoom, Facebook, and later on YouTube. And for those who are on Zoom, just a reminder, you'll get an email from me tomorrow morning with a feedback survey. Please fill that out. Let me know what you thought of tonight's event. And I hope to see many of you for James Patterson in 2 weeks. So thanks again. Thank you, Wayne. And everyone have a great night.
Happy holidays, folks.
Right back at you.